All right, we're about to get started. We have had, as is our custom, folks in breakout rooms to get to know each other for the first 15 minutes. And we've been getting to know each other in the first 15 minutes here in person. We have a large group today. It's great to see you all. Thanks for coming out. Just a heads up that we do have another in our series, November 13th, next month. So come on out for that. But without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today. Brent Kaup holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, the best sociology program in the world. He is not only professor of sociology at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, but also the director of the Environment and Sustainability Program there. His new co-authored project with Kelly Austin, who I understand is also on the call and will weigh in on different questions at different points in the proceedings, is Pathogens of Finance: How Capitalism Breeds Vector-Borne Disease. Please help me welcome Brent Kaup.
All right, I think I hit unmute so everybody can hear me online, but if not, let me know. So a big thanks to everybody for showing up and for having me. Thanks to Joe and the Global Health Politics Workshop Board who decided to invite me, and to the Party Center as well. So as Joe mentioned today, I'm going to talk about my book project that I co-authored with Kelly Austin titled the Pathogens of Finance. And so in the book, one thing that we're really trying to do is we're trying to think through, what are the drivers of these increases in vector-borne diseases across the globe, right? And if we kind of look at this from a variety of perspectives, we see that the WHO says dengue has increased by about an 8-fold increase in the last 20 years. There's now around 100 to 400 more million infections per year. If we look at malaria, we could say we made some progress in the early 2000s, but incidence rates have increased by about 5% or so since around 2015. So we're looking at around 263 million cases of malaria a year. And then, if we want to look more locally here, we can look at the CDC data around Lyme disease. And there's been close to a 200% increase since 2000. So, much fewer cases than dengue and malaria, but, we have about 90,000 reported cases of Lyme a year, but it's probably closer to about 500,000 cases a year when you take into account the ones that aren't reported to the CDC, which are quite a few. Now, if we look at the reasons, the most common explanations for the increases in vector-borne disease, we kind of see three different reasons that float around quite a bit in particularly the natural science literature. One's climate change and global warming, right? Warming temperatures, increased rainfall, increased humidity. All of these things have kind of created more hospitable environments for insects, in particular insect vectors, right? The second thing that you see a lot of is about landscape change. There's been an expansion of human settlements, particularly on the edges of urban areas, and this kind of disrupts insect environments, right? Causes zoonotic spillover. And then at the same time, in some places where we have longer existing settlements, the urban environments are actually deteriorating, right? So sewage and sanitation systems and stuff like that are getting old and aging out and creating more hospitable environments for mosquitoes, for example. And the last thing that you hear a little bit about is behavioral change, right? So there are more people in places with insect vectors at times, kind of when the insects are more active, and people aren't properly protecting themselves from insects. And there are various studies, and they show all these things to actually be occurring. But for Kelly and I in the book, we really found that a lot of these explanations were devoid of political explanations or economic explanations these are kind of the causes for us that kind of make these things actually happen. In other words, these kind of mainstream explanations for the increases in vector-borne disease don't look at the broader political, economic, or in the case of the book, the broader political, ecological causes of what is happening. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today, and what we talk about in the book more broadly. And in particular, we look at how the broader financialization of life, of society, of the planet, in particular, has really driven these increases in vector-borne disease and our responses to them. There's kind of two parts of the book, one looking at the driving the increase of the disease and one looking at how it impacts what we do about it, right? And so just to kind of give you a brief overview for those of you who aren't familiar with the notions of finance or financialization, this financialization of life, right? Really, we kind of follow Gerald Epstein's notion of financialization here when we're talking about periods of time when financial motives, financial markets, financial actors really come to have this kind of outsized role in society, right? So there are times when the world are times when the world really becomes shaped by and for finance, right? And we could say we're in one of these periods now. We may be coming out of it, but we're in one of these periods now and have been for about 40 or 50 years, you could say. You know, and you can find this in a lot of the business press. If you read the Washington Post or Forbes or the Financial Times, there's frequent commentaries in those papers, you know, about whether finance has accrued too much power, had inverse impacts upon society, so forth and so on. Now, in the book, we look at financialization through the three primary lenses here that are listed on the screen, right? And so first, we look at the increase in financial innovation and the creation of new financial products. In particular, new forms of things like financial securities and securitization. You know, if you want to think about it today, you can pretty much everything's pretty much been securitized, right? You can buy a weather derivative for a catastrophe if you want, right? If you want to hedge, you know, whether or not it's going to rain for your crops, you can do that, right? But a couple of the major things that we think about in the book are mortgage-backed securities, as well as things like coffee futures in the case of Uganda, which we can talk about later if you want, or Kelly can talk about better than I can. Now, the second thing we think about is debt, right? And debt is really something that's always been around, right? But over the last 30 or 40 years, we've actually seen substantial increases in the amount of debt. And this is both debt issued to countries as well as debt issued to individuals. And of course, this is inherently related to the fact that debt itself has become securitized more and more over time, right? And third, we look at the kind of ever increasing drive to enhance shareholder value. So what this means is that the producers of things, of commodities, really have become less interested in making products, right, and making money off of actual commodities, and more interested in raising the value of their company's stocks, right? And so most of us, you know, if we read those papers I mentioned, you know, they may have this adverse impact upon society, but we're told these things are good in a basic sense, right? That we're purportedly benefactors of Wall Street as well. You know, somewhere around 60% of Americans own stock. And, you know, if we're lucky enough to own a house, you know, the prices of our houses and the values of our houses have increased quite substantially, particularly over the past decade, but very substantially since the 1980s, right? But as I kind of mentioned, we also know that there's a number of adverse impacts here that go along with this, right? Inequality in the United States now sits at the highest rates it has since the Gilded Age, right? And most people's wages have been stagnant for decades, right? Now, in the book, we are, of course, worried about all these things, but what we're really interested in is how finance has remade the planet, right? The physicality, the materiality of the planet. In particular, you know, how finance can be credited with the creation of physical landscapes that increasingly make us sick and that make the purported solutions that fail to make us well, right? And so hence the name, the pathogens of finance. And so we make two primary arguments, and the first is listed here on the screen. Financialization has altered the planetary landscape in ways that have made vector-borne disease more likely to spread and emerge. And here we're talking about everything from the links between mortgage-backed securities, exurbanization, and tick-borne disease, to the links between, you know, maybe you drinking your coffee and checking your 401k in the morning, increases in national debt, spread of monocrop agriculture, and the increases in mosquitoes and mosquito-borne disease. Now, the second argument that we make here, if I can get it to move forward, is this, right? Financialization has created a global public health system that's more focused on shareholder value than treating human illness. And here we're talking about the drive towards shareholder value by insurance companies, by big pharma, and even universities, right? And how all of these entities have really placed responsibility for vector-borne disease on and in individual human and insect bodies, right? And they've made it more difficult to get treatment for those who are sick. And we also show how this drive towards shareholder value is in part and parcel part of global lending practices and debt issuance as well. So in the book, we talk this through in terms of three seemingly disparate and unrelated cases, right? And in particular, when we thought this through, one of the things that we were thinking about is these places are places where you wouldn't necessarily expect the trends to be going the ways that they are. So in the United States, for example, we think through the links between mortgage-backed securities, exurbanization, and tick-borne disease, as well as how the drive for shareholder value amongst health insurance made getting treatment for Lyme disease more difficult in places like the state of Virginia. And I'll talk more about this case as kind of the exemplar today. Now in Brazil, we think about how the rising national debt in the 1980s changes how and whom debt is issued to, and then how this favors big ag in the Brazilian interior and kind of creates the conditions in these agricultural outposts where the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the yellow fever, dengue mosquito can thrive. And we also think about how the push to make mosquitoes into financial products themselves has in some ways shaped the creation and deployment of modified insects, right? Modified mosquitoes as a solution to mosquito-borne disease in the country. And in Uganda, we think about how increasing debt and the increasing volatility of the coffee's future markets led coffee growers towards less sustainable practices in terms of growing the coffee in the Bududa region that both created more amenable mosquito environments and made people more exposed to malaria itself. And we also talk about how these processes and the drive by big pharma to kind of create shareholder value keeps the most effective malaria medicines out of the hands of those who need it the most. But as I kind of mentioned, today I'm going to focus on the case of Lyme disease in particular in Virginia, but some of it may actually be applicable to Lyme disease around here as well. And so if we think back to these kind of common explanations, the common explanations for Lyme disease, we have this one that I mentioned before, that changes to the environment have increased Lyme disease. And many of you are probably very aware of this, right? The data shows that due to climate change, environments in the northern United States, particularly in this part of the United States, have become more amenable to ticks and tick-borne disease. Again, everything from increasing temperatures to increasing humidity has made more hospitable environments for both ticks as well as their host, and Lyme disease carriers, right? Everything from mice for the carriers of Lyme disease to tick hosts like deer, stuff like that. So that's one of the explanations that we get, right? Now, the other one that we get is this changes in human behavior thing that I mentioned earlier. And so here the idea is that there are people who are spending more time outside near ticks, and they're thus more exposed to Lyme disease. You know, this explanation is a little bit funny because the data on the average time for people spent outdoors in the United States actually shows that people spend less time outdoors now than they did 50 years ago. But the idea goes that the people who do spend more time outdoors do so in places where ticks like to live, right? So as I kind of mentioned, one of the things that we did or wanted to do here in this project was to think about places that may be a bit of an anomaly, right? And Virginia is a bit of an anomaly when you think about increases in Lyme disease, because if you look at the epicenter of Lyme, it's actually moving in a northwestern direction from very near here, where we sit now, right? In the northeastern states. However, as you can see from the chart on the screen, you know, Lyme disease in Virginia went from being basically non-existent in the 1980s to increasing quite substantially over time. And so the question for us became, you know, why did we see Lyme disease move in the southern direction when it should be moving in the other direction, right? And to answer this question, you really have to kind of take this kind of socio-historical approach that I was talking about to understand the changing landscapes of Virginia, right? Now, in the book, I actually talk about a longer history here, like a 500,000 year history of black-legged ticks and Lyme disease in North America. And I talk about, Virginian history, and I trace it back to the colonial era. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer it later. But given that I only have about 30 more minutes, for the sake of time, I'll just go over the last 80 years of history or so in that period of time. Yeah, yeah. Well, we can talk about, the DNA extraction from mice later if you want for Lyme. But we got to start here, right? So when we think about landscape change in Virginia and kind of place it within the broader history of the United States, we really have to think about New Deal policy and New Deal regulation. And at this point in time, in the 1940s and 1950s, we put into place a number of kind of national policies around home ownership that created an invested population of property owners. We could think of something like the Homeowners Loan Act, for example. It really sought to make sure that everybody in the United States had access to a bank. And that was either to obtain or to refinance their loan after the Great Depression, right? If you look at it prior to 1933, only about 1/3 of counties in the United States had banks. But after the Homeowners Loan Act was put into place, almost every county did, right? Now, the Homeowners Loan Act also created the publicly owned and capitalized Homeowners Loan Corporation. And this is actually what created, what most of us would think of as a mortgage today. It created the kind of standardized self-amortizing 15 to 30-year mortgage with a 20% down that we know of. And of course, all of these things were actually backed by the Federal Housing Administration, hence the name of the FHA loans that we all get, right? That many homeowners have. And so all of these things made single-family homes in the United States relatively accessible as long as you were lower middle class and above, and of course, as long as you were white. So besides that, though, we also see that New Deal policies shape banks, right? And most notably, the Banking Acts of 1933 and 1935 separated the industry into three different parts with different responsibilities. And so on the screen, you see pictured savings and loans associations. And these were the places that were really responsible for consumer savings and lending. So they were the place where most everyday people would put their money, and the place where people would go to get a mortgage. And then besides that, we had commercial banks that dealt with businesses, and we had securities and investment firms that were relegated to really trading things on the stock market, right? And they all had separate entities and separate duties, and they weren't supposed to interfere with each other's duties that much, right? And so these things, this kind of separation of banks and the national legislation around housing really had a number of interesting and relevant impacts upon the US residential landscape. So first, there was this regulation called Regulation Q, and it actually made it so savings and loans banks could give people higher interest rates on their savings and lower interest rates on loans, right? And so this is why most consumers put their money in those banks and why most people got their mortgages there. Now, second, the Homeowners Loan Act actually made it so that banks could only issue mortgages on properties within a certain distance of their physical location, right? So it was around 50 miles or so. And so this meant that if you put your money in a bank at that point in time, it actually stayed local. Something that maybe some of us proactively look for today because we want that to happen. But many of us have mortgages that are from, maybe the Bank of Oklahoma, and you live in Massachusetts or something like that, right? And so these regulations really operated on the notion that the world was credit short and a capital starved place. There was only so much money to go around, and so how far it could go was legally regulated through all of these things. And what happened was this really shaped mid-century American suburbanization to look like what we see on the screen, right? People received money for single-family homes, but they were usually on lots of around a quarter acre or less. And so compared to today's standards, the homes were relatively modest in size, right? The residential landscapes still were kind of surrounded by turf grass and maybe some trees and some shrubs. But this type of environment wasn't really that conducive to the presence of ticks and tick-borne disease. But this all actually started to change in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And for a variety of reasons, which I can talk about later if folks are interested, commercial banks and securities and investment firms, they started to create and offer an array of new financial products to the everyday consumer that made them want to take their money out of the savings and loans banks and put it into these new products, right? At first, these things were probably what we would consider pretty mundane financial products today, right? Things like a money market account, which many people have, or CDs. Sorry, just to clarify, certificates of deposits, negotiable certificates of deposits. These things were new at that point in time, right? But over time, these kind of new financial products became more complex. And started to be things like mortgage-backed securities, which I'll talk about in a bit. At the same time, we actually start to see the deregulation of the banking industry more broadly. In 1980, we saw the passage of a bill called the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, and there was another act called the Garn-St. Germain Act. And what these laws actually did was they kind of eliminated interest rate ceilings on deposit accounts and allowed banks to offer loans at interest rates of their choosing, right? And so because of these changes, what we actually start to see happen is that the savings and loans institutions are no longer the prominent place that people are going for their mortgages, right? So there are a number of relevant impacts here. As I kind of mentioned, it led to the creation and use of mortgage-backed securities. And these were actually invented in the 1960s and 70s, but they really expanded in use in the 1980s. And second, as this occurred, savings and loan banks were no longer the primary source where people went for mortgages. And this is kind of what you see on the screen here. People started to go to mortgage brokers, right? And mortgage companies for their loans. And so what happened is that these companies didn't actually hold the loans. When you go to the savings and loans bank before, they would keep your loan for 30 years until it's the end, and then they'd make money and lend it out to other people. But when you went to the broker and it was turned into a mortgage-backed security, they were packed into pools and trust, which were then sold on Wall Street. And if any of you have a mixed investment fund, you probably own a share of my house or somebody else's house in your mixed investment fund, right? And you see here that by 1990 or so, more mortgages are held in pools and trusts than by actual banks, right? And mortgage-backed securities, if we think of it in terms of the credit short, capital starved world, they were supposed to be a solution to this problem, a way in which we could lend more money to more people after we offloaded the cost onto Wall Street and let individuals buy small chunks of it. But what actually happened was because of the regulatory changes around banks and housing, there was actually a change in who could get a house and from where, right? So in the 1980s and early 1990s, mortgage interest rates became detached from savings interest rates at banks. And the former increased fairly substantially, right? The mortgage interest rates increased quite a bit, right? If you look at the late 1980s, we're talking about like 9% interest rates, something like that, which even by today's standards, you're like, wow, that's pretty high. And so what that meant was that really only upper middle class folks and above could get a mortgage. And at the same time, those rules that regulated how far a bank could lend, those rules were changed too, right? And the caps on mortgages changed as well. So mortgages ended up going to fewer people at larger amounts, starting in the 1980s and 1990s. And so the result was that the average size and lots of homes in the United States and in Virginia in particular became larger, right? The average size of new homes increased by about 200 square feet in the 1980s. And by the early 1990s, lots larger than an acre accounted for the majority of land use for new single-family homes in the United States. And suburbia grew to look like this, like something on the screen, right? Large homes on large lots surrounded by lots of what the natural scientists call fragmented forest and forest edge, the later of which make ideal environments for ticks and tick-borne disease, right? So some of you may be asking, okay, great, you've just told us, 60-year history of the United States or whatever. Where does Virginia come in? Well, in 1984, the Reagan administration actually assembled a group or a commission called the Grace Commission, and this committee was assembled to supposedly cut government cost, cut the cost of government services, largely through privatization. It of course really didn't save the government any money at all, but it did create a whole bunch of decently and fairly well-paying jobs in Northern Virginia, in things like defense as well as IT, right? Um, and so what we see is that in Northern Virginia from the 19 onwards, we have this kind of population boom that occurs. And so on the screen, I have the 3-county total listed on top, as well as the 3 kind of counties that experienced the larger booms at that point in time: Fairfax County, Prince William County, and Loudoun County. And if you don't know anything about these 3 counties, they are regularly they're consistently rated as 3 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in the United States. And they are definitely wealthier than the rest of Virginia. And so how does this impact the landscape? And so I'll show you a series of aerial shots here to kind of see where it is. And this is just one example. And I took it from fairly close into DC just so you can see the different types of suburbanization happen in one shot. But if we were to actually go further out from DC, from Northern Virginia, you'd see that exurbanization landscape, which you'll see in a second, even more so, right? And so on the screen here, you see northeastern Fairfax in 1953. The river there where the arrow is, the Potomac, and the north side is Washington, D.C. And if you're looking at the aerial shot here, you basically see that this is mostly agricultural land and forested land at this point in time, right? So let's jump ahead here to 1972. So in 1972, you kind of see that a lot of that agricultural land, particularly over on the left-hand side of the screen, has been filled in with that kind of tight post-war residential housing that I talked about. They're smaller lots, modest-sized homes, that kind of early post-war American suburbanization that happened, right? And again, these are types of lots that aren't really that conducive to ticks and tick-borne disease. Ticks can't really travel very far on their own, and they don't really survive very well in places that are exposed to lots of sun. So let's go here to 1990. So we see that there's quite a bit of more infill here, and the color photo helps a bit too. But you see here in kind of the center of the screen, this new type of suburbanization that is happening, right? You see that there's the creation of this more ideal tick and tick-borne disease environment, particularly with lots of kind of forest edge and fragmented forest that occurs, right? And so if you're trying to think through this forest edge and fragmented forest idea, on the forest edge is where ticks and tick hosts, they really like to hang out there, right? And that's because this is where the light gets through the forest. And so it creates lots of grass and saplings. It's a good place for grass and saplings to grow, which are all great sources of food for white-tailed deer, right? And so the deer spend lots of time there, and the ticks can easily grab onto them. The deer don't actually carry Lyme disease, but as one of the largest mammals, they serve as the primary food source for ticks and distribute them to other places, right? Now, at the same time, we see lots of fragmented forest happen in these exurban places, right? Now, in these places, it's thought that Lyme disease is more prevalent, right? And this is because in these fragmented forests, where they're not connected to other forests, there are fewer predators for both things like ticks and their tick host, in particular the white-footed mice, right? The primary carriers of Lyme disease. So once Lyme is kind of established in these places where there's fragmented forest, it's more likely to stay there, and it's going to be more prevalent, likely more prevalent as well, right? So what we see here is that finance-driven landscape occurs in places like Northern Virginia. tick and tick-borne diseases like Lyme do as well. You can see that, over the past 5 to 6 years, it's gotten a little bit under control just due to some, decent public health efforts, particularly in these 3 counties. But in Virginia as a whole, again, I said if we were to go further out, right, we would still see a pretty steady increase in the rates overall um, uh, in terms of what's happening. So some of you may be wondering, in getting back to the question here from the beginning, right? What are we supposed to do about this, right? You identify all these huge kind of problems related to finance, right? And so how is it that we can think of this maybe a bit differently? And so Kelly and I do this in the book. And one thing that I think that we really have to think about is that we have to think about and find ways to decrease the power of financiers. Financiers clearly have a role in contemporary society. But, if you look at classical theorists, it doesn't matter if you're looking at, Adam Smith, Frederick Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, or Karl Marx, all of them alike really depicted financiers in a quite pejorative manner, right? Seeing them as a group of people who are extracting wealth from those who actually produce things. There's a similar depiction of financiers in the contemporary press by writers like Paul Krugman, or if you like popular fiction, you can see Kim Stanley Robinson, in Ministry for the Future depict financiers in this way as well, right? But other social theorists have some, maybe provocative ideas that are perhaps useful here, right? People like Pierre Joseph Proudhon has suggested that many of the problems created by finance could be resolved by creating what he called a bank of the people, right? And so Kelly and I were like, well, what we need is not just a bank of the people, but maybe a bank of the planet, right? A bank that kind of prioritizes regenerative ecologies and human flourishing, and in turn, the creation of landscapes that improve health and well-being of both the planet and its occupants, right? And one way that we think this can be done is through drawing on the work of scholars who promote the democratization of finance in some ways, right? And so when we think about finance, we have to remember that flows of money in the United States and really across the world are currently regulated by a number of actually existing real institutions that are there today. And these institutions are regulated and act to uphold specific interest and impact our daily actions, right? Now, most of us actually don't think twice about putting our money in the bank. Maybe we do more so today than we did last year, but most of us don't think twice about putting our money in the bank because we know that banks are FDIC insured, right? In addition, things like mortgage markets are and have long been regulated, particularly in the United States. So one thing we say that we suggest in the book is that we can link loans to sustainability. There are a whole host of things that banks already consider when making a mortgage. So why not make the mortgage contingent upon creating a landscape that is less prone to vector-borne diseases or one of these things that we talk about in the book, right? Now, another thing that we talk about is revitalizing investment in public infrastructure. And I didn't talk much about this today because it's not as directly relevant in the Lyme disease case in Virginia. But in our other cases, one of the things we draw attention to is how non-existing or degrading infrastructure is making mosquito-borne diseases worse, right? In particular, Aedes aegypti-borne diseases such as dengue, Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, these kinds of things. And the problem here is globally, we aren't really investing enough money in infrastructure for things like water, sewage, sanitation, these kinds of things. We're not investing fast enough, or we're not investing in the right places. And when we do, we see these investments as profit-making activities. So what happens is the places where profit can't be made are really left out. And these are actually the places most prone to vector-borne diseases. But it wasn't always like this, right? We actually used to fund things with public dollars, and when loans were needed, we actually gave them at lower interest rates to public entities. And so in the book, we kind of think that we should think about doing this again, both in the United States and elsewhere. Now, another thing we talk about in the book, again, less relevant to the Lyme case, But we talk about decentering the US dollar as a means of finance. Um, and again, this probably, would be more important in the Brazilian and the Ugandan cases than in Virginia. And I will say that decentering of the US dollar in some ways is happening right now more than we imagined it would when we wrote the book, and for different reasons than we laid out in the book. But if we want to think about how this could work, right, in the mid 20th century, there was the non-aligned movement that actually occurred, and people were able to kind of pit, at that point in time, the Soviet Union against the United States in order to get differential loan rates and better packages, to get infrastructure built and to fund infrastructure, right? And so what we're trying to say here is, let's try to recreate something like that, maybe create an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF by prioritizing a broader array of global currencies in global finance, right? And in trade itself. Um, and then the last thing we talk about is decommodifying public goods. And here we're talking about the creation of things like a robust public healthcare systems and the decommodification of science and the creation of knowledge, right? Robust public healthcare systems would really allow people to get the treatment for the vector-borne diseases without having to worry about their insurance denying a claim, which happens sometimes in the US around Lyme disease. And they wouldn't have to worry about, being able to obtain and complete a treatment for a disease like malaria without having to worry about how purchasing the drugs they need may impact the next meal that they need, right? As is the case in Uganda for many folks, right? If we want to look at it even further, we could say that over the past 40 years, scientists and universities have also shifted how they fund innovation, right? And in medicine, what we've seen is folks, we've kind of gone from trying to create cures to trying to create profitable products. And this isn't really the fault of individual scientists, it's more the fault of the funding model itself, right? Um, but these systems that we all participate in, we should think about what the implications are for creating possible vaccines, drugs, and other possible entities to help us resolve the contemporary problems around vector-borne disease and what it means to be trying to make a product instead of the cure itself. So I will stop there and take any questions that you may have.